Scano, Deoi Jot Niwak Sedaden, Otahioni Niwak Shouten, Gaikono Niwak Wenzeden, Gagweni. My name is Terry Morrow. I'm a registered dietitian from 6 Nations of the Grand River and a community partner on this project. The project describes experiences and perceptions from residential school survivors and their intergenerational adult children, as well as community stakeholders in food, farming, and experiences at the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School located in 6 Nations of the Grand River. Our funding partners are the Insight Development Grant from SSHRC, the 6 Nations themselves, and the respected universities, Waterloo, Toronto Metropolitan, and McMaster University. Community partner advisors were myself, Shirlene Bomberry, Chandra Miracle, and Rick Hill. Principal investigator is Dr. Sandra Juutilainen, and Dr. Bonnie Freeman, Dr. Rona Hanning, and Dr. Jennifer Yessis. This is an Indigenous-led research project, and 6 Nations of the Grand River has their own ethics committee. So a submission was done there, as well as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council is also respected within the community to share the information with as well. And community level ethics ensures safe handling of the material from the respected universities. Our first meeting was at 6 Nations of the Grand River. Here we got together. We were very fortunate to have Rick Hill, the Haudenosaunee historians, share with us some information about the Woodland Cultural Center and the mush hole itself, where the meeting actually took place. Some discussion centered around the two-row wampum. And the two-row wampum is really important because in Haudenosaunee culture, I think it really does have an underlining factor about relationships, your relationship with yourself, and then the relationships that actually you encounter from others, plants, animals, people, and the environment that surrounds you. Here you can see Jake Thomas holding that. And this is our team, some of our team. And an example, we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners within the project. How do we relate to each other? What does it mean within our research project, the two-row paradigm? Again, how are we utilizing community collaboration to really merge with our academic minds? So our qualitative tools were developed in that way, collaboratively. We had 3 separate surveys for residential school survivors, their adult children, and community stakeholders. And again, community advisors were involved at all stages of our research process. 23 interviews were completed with former residential school attendees, their family members, so their adult children, and community stakeholders within 6 Nations of the Grand River. So we did make sure cultural safe practices took place and respecting what was needed by the community members and proposed. The qualitative interviews were audio recorded and have been transcribed. Our initial data is still ongoing. So the analysis, when completed, will be reported back to all members of the research team for sense making of the data, and then any future publications for collaborators or anybody from 6 Nations. Digital stories were also created, and we created these from a local multimedia production company on 6 Nations of the Grand River. They had extensive experience working with residential survivors and actually archiving a lot of the language within the community as well. So it was really important to work with somebody local. We also had an opening and closing done of the digital story workshop, and that was done by Eddie Thomas. He's a local knowledge keeper, Haudenosaunee knowledge keeper and language leader. He actually shares the opening and closing to bring our minds together and to make sure that we're all in a safe environment. COVID did have a slight impact on we did have to have extensions, but thankfully with the type of material that we were collecting, that we were able to get all of the interviews completed prior to, as well as the digital stories just before COVID hit. So we did have, extensions for the remainder of the project. And survivors and intergenerational stories were really an underlining factor in a case that we'll put forward here to talk about some of the main food experiences prior to, during, and after the Indian residential school, and the impact on their survivor and the intergenerational family members. So I think one of these themes here that kind of came out was, not fully connected to family or community. And that's what the food experience had kind of felt like for Beverly, the mother that attended the school, and Elizabeth, her adult daughter. And they had some very different perspectives on how it impacts their life today. So the change that they identified was in the way that they had fed their families. So Beverly would say, when we go to have meals, we would be like very military, and Elizabeth says, food, it seemed very processed and easy. So you can see that they had their own perspectives on how it impacted them in their families' lives. The stakeholder interviews were also really important aspects to see how well we were able to move away from the colonial construct of food and the idea of food within the community, because Six Nations has a lot of traditional food knowledge keepers within it because of the culture. So again, it was, a return to food sharing. And a great quote by Chandra, one of the community providers: if education and food can be used as a weapon to take away culture, to harm people, then the opposite must be true. Education and food can also be used to relearn the good way to living a good life, and that's really what some of these stories really helped us to identify, and, the stakeholders' perspective as well. So some resources that could be forthcoming. We did put together a book chapter. The digital stories are also available on the webpage at the Center for Studies in Food Security on the Toronto Metropolitan University website. So those are great tools to be able to continue to share their survivors' story themselves. They always tell it the best, right? So Yamako, thank you so much for your time today, and I really appreciate you listening briefly to what we are able to share with you about our research project today.